I'm not a graphic designer. I don't do this kind of work in my day-to-day life. So these are just kind of the tips and tricks that I've picked up while I'm doing this kind of, I guess, in a volunteer capacity. So I thought to start off nice and easy, we could chat about, well, what are infographics? Does anybody want to have a quick go at answering what are infographics? What do you think of when you think of infographics?
Information on a graphic. Yep.
Love it. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm proud of myself for that one.
No. That is 100%.
I guess sort of little diagrams that kind of illustrate, you know, how things work with arrows or, yeah, that's.
Yeah. Yeah. No, those are two perfect answers. They kind of do what they say on the tin, really. Infographic, informational graphic. So exactly, they're a way of displaying information visually using graphics. But really what they're for is they help us to make connections and see patterns more quickly than if the information were displayed through text. So they really help people to kind of make those neural connections really quickly by using these little graphics.
And just to add in from the chat, Anitra says, images tell 1,000 words.
Oh, love it. And yes, thank you. Please do let me know if anything comes in the chat. I can't see it while I'm screen sharing. So yes, do let me know. Cool. So a couple things infographics should do. They should tell a story visually. They should display information clearly, concisely, and accurately. They should have a logical order and layout, and they should condense information down into the most important points. So I think the big kind of takeaway is you want to be picking your information carefully and really being concise in what you're trying to share through these visual means. A couple things they shouldn't do. It sounds pretty obvious, but infographics shouldn't obscure, manipulate, or skew the data. Sounds obvious, but infamously, there are a few major news organizations in Australia that really struggle with this one. So as you can see from the example to the right there, the pie chart, they did a poll. The no votes got a lot higher. The yes votes got a lot lower, but you wouldn't be blamed for thinking that the yes vote was a much higher proportion by looking at that pie chart. That's not great. So when we're doing our infographics, we should try and avoid that best of our abilities. And also infographics shouldn't try to fit too much information in, keep it simple. So I just want to quickly run through some of the different types of infographics you might come across and when we might use them. They're all reasonably straightforward. So the first one you might encounter are list form infographics. So these are really just essentially more visually appealing ways of listing information. So if you were typing up a Word document, this might be where you would be using bullet points. But instead of using bullet points in an infographic, we might use graphics or icons. We might use these big kind of graphic numbers to help kind of direct that flow of information. As you can see from the two examples to the side there, you know, you've got these little images that are used to help visualize the items on the list in just a slightly more kind of attractive and interesting way to follow than if they were just listed out in text form. The next type of infographic you might see are timeline infographics. So again, really self-explanatory. These are ways of visualizing dates and events in chronological order. So like with any timeline, you usually organize it with some kind of line down the middle, and there'll be dates, events, or milestones kind of jutting off that line. You can get as creative as you want with how you display that information though. And so you can see from the examples on the page, there are all kinds of different choices that you might make around how you design that, but basically they help to emphasize those key milestones along a journey. Process infographics are pretty similar to timeline infographics, but I like to think of them as kind of being like a recipe or like a method for a science experiment. So basically they're where we're trying to communicate kind of each step that's involved in a process. So you might use numbers and again, graphics and things like that to help kind of label the steps and keep that flow of information clear. So step 1, step 2, step 3. And again, it's just a more visually interesting way of kind of displaying that information. One of the most common types of infographics that you might see is statistical infographics. So these are ones where we're trying to display data through these kind of visual means. So they'll often use charts and graphs and icons to display that information. And so, for example, you might want to display key results from a survey. So say you've just done a survey of members of your organization. People aren't necessarily going to read a 50-page report on all of the results that came out of that survey. So you might want to condense that down into just a nice one-page infographic with kind of some of the key highlights that came out of that. So you'd be using these kind of big graphic numbers, pie charts, and little kind of graphics and icons to help highlight some of that information in a kind of easier to digest way. You've got geographic infographics. So again, these are kind of location specific information. They're usually in the form of a map, as you can see from the examples here. These ones are pretty self-explanatory. They might be, kind of information about a location, demographics, things like that you might choose to display in this way. And then the final one that I just want to look at is comparison infographics. So these are where you're, say, comparing two different types of things, cats or dogs, tea or coffee, dogs or coyotes, whatever it might be. So usually they're organized with a split down the middle, one option on one side, one option on the other. But again, they're just a bit more interesting way of displaying things than a straight out kind of word table. So you might, again, choose to use these graphics, choose to use these kind of typographies and things like that to make it a bit more visually appealing. So once you've kind of chosen your type of infographic, that's when you want to start thinking about how you plan that layout. And I just thought I'd pause here quickly to make sure there aren't any questions or any comments on the types of infographics before we move on. All good? Cool. Yeah, so planning your layout and how to organize that information once you've kind of figured out what type of infographic you're looking at based on the information you're trying to convey. So the first point I want to make here is get creative, get as creative as you want. One really useful thing to think about is metaphor and how you might use metaphor to communicate that information. So metaphors can really help to make those patterns and connections clearer. And so we've got the really clear example there of the image of the roadmap and the little image of the road that represents the roadmap. That can be useful for either timeline or process type infographics. And it seems kind of cliche and it seems like a kind of boring one, but sometimes those boring metaphors can actually be really powerful and useful because they're things people will immediately recognize. So they're immediately going to know what they're looking for in terms of information. They know, oh, it's a roadmap. There's going to be a point A and a point B, and there's going to be stops off along the way. So it makes it easier for them to then digest that information. So don't be afraid of using those kind of boring metaphors, but also get as creative as you want with those kinds of things. The sky's the limit, really, in terms of what metaphors and what images you might use to display that information. So we've got a couple of other examples there of a little iceberg or a star. And yeah, you might choose to display that information all kinds of different ways. A couple of tips around layout. So again, the really most important thing with infographics is organizing your information in a logical way that helps your viewer to see what's most important. So you might choose to use lines, boxes, arrows, or numbers to help really direct that flow of information down the infographic. So you can see in the example across there, the way that they've used these little boxed out sections of information to make it really clear which points of data relate to which subheadings. Then they've also used these big kind of graphic numbers to help really highlight the key important information. And then they've also used these little kind of graphic images to again make it really clear on first glance what each subheading is about. So whether it's about food, so you've got the little plate there, you've got the little first aid kit when it's about health, it just makes it a little bit quicker and easier to understand. So thinking about those kinds of things when you're planning a layout can be really helpful. Some notes on color. So the first kind of most obvious thing to think about when you're thinking about color is branding. So does your organization have brand colors that you could use in the infographic? So I think the example before is a really good example of that. Anybody who has any kind of history or knowledge of Amnesty International, when they look at that infographic, is going to go, oh, that's an Amnesty yellow right there. So it's going to be immediately recognizable. So you might choose to use that. If that's not a factor, if you're making these infographics just for your own use, or branding doesn't come into it, thinking back to your kind of school days and the color wheel can be really helpful. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this today because this really isn't a design class. It's kind of a step one class. But I've put some images up there that you can have a look at and think about when you're thinking about your infographic. And so you might think about making a monochromatic infographic. So that's just using one color scheme, which can be really good if you want to keep things kind of nice and simple and clean. Then there's also analogous colors, which are the colors that sit next to each other along the color wheel. You've also then got complementary colors, which kind of sit opposite each other on a color wheel. So these are all the kinds of things that you can think about when you're thinking about the design. Another thing that you can think about is how you can use color to draw out those important points of information. So the bottom image, there are 15 little circles, and one of those circles is red. So if you were trying to display information about a statistic where it was 1 in 15 of something, this could be a really kind of powerful way to make that immediately visually clear to someone, kind of the size and the scope of that data. Both of those images are drawn from this little blog that I've linked down here, and we'll share all of these things afterwards. So if you want to kind of dig more deeply into color choices and things like that, do go and check that out. So yeah, I'm not going to go into too much detail about that today. But I think the most important point that I'll make about color and color choice is accessibility. So when we're picking out color choices, we want to think about making sure that our infographics are viewable by as many people as possible. So think about people who have color blindness, think about trying not to use too many kind of dark colors right next to each other where you might not be able to see those differences in the tones. But a really handy tool for that, Adobe has a nice color contrast analyzer that I believe is free to use. You can actually just input your color palette into that, and they will kind of spit out back a accessibility score for you, and they'll kind of give you some tips about how you can make that color palette more accessible and things like that. So that can be a really kind of handy tool to use if you're kind of just starting out in making these choices. Cool. So those are kind of the introductory things about designing infographics. Does anybody have any kind of questions before we jump into an exercise? Thing before I wrap up with any questions is the Commons is always looking for people to help out with some of this stuff, with turning some of their articles and things like that into little infographics that are shareable to help share more of these ideas with a wider audience. If you're kind of enjoying this, or you want a bit more practice and you're interested in working with the Commons at all, do reach out to Aoife after this. Her email's in the chat on the screen there, and we'll share it afterwards. And we've got a whole list of Commons articles that need kind of turning into infographics. So if you did want a bit more practice, then there's always that option there. Yeah, so are there any kind of questions or anything before we finish up for the night? And there's